welcome to Ask and Praxis. It's the 20th of October, as I've highlighted here. We have the team on the call, sans Emily, who is on a leave of absence. We all have our own sort of things that we add into the conversation, some of which are useful, some of which are me talking. So, hopefully we have a perspective that can be useful to each of you in your roles at what you do as well. So today's topic is Teams and SharePoint, and there's a lot to say there. So I think we've reserved the right to do a few more sessions on this, maybe after we talk about whatever Krista wants us to talk about next. So here's our agenda. We believe pretty strongly at Praxis that this isn't an or, you use Teams or you use SharePoint. It's really an and. So the question is understanding what that and looks like and how to think about it. So a little bit of a what to use when, and we've put together some use cases that we think are illustrative of some of the different ways that you can make this split work and make sense of it. Hopefully they'll shed some light on how we're thinking about it. There are some dev topics involved, and I'm sure Julie will remember what those are when we get to them. I don't. And then we have a couple of resources, though not a lot. We will find more for you as we go along. So we're going to focus on one main use case today, and that's why we reserve the right to talk about some of these other ones at a later time, because I think in 30 minutes we can probably just talk about how we collaborate around the content on a particular project together as a topic. Who would like to say something first? I mean, I can keep talking for hours,
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. So I think something we're going to pepper a lot of this with, and really the guiding light for me on this is let the business have a say in this. I was going to say let the business decide, but they don't get the decision. But as technical folks, and I'm kind of mostly speaking for myself, I have a tendency to get excited about technology and trying to force folks to do what I think is technically cool at the time. And I think for this, as we go deeper in the weeds on whether to use Teams or whether to use SharePoint, really, if there's an entrenched workflow or an entrenched, business process, that should be taken into account. It shouldn't make the decision for you, but it should definitely be considered. And like a great example, we talked about this a little bit when we were prepping for this. If a company is using SharePoint and is comfortable with that, and the users are comfortable with it, and the business processes work with it, it doesn't make a lot of sense to force them to go to Teams just for Teams' sake. Now, if there's, when Julie talks about the dev stuff or whatever, there's a good reason that should come in, but don't do it just for the technology's sake. So always keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think as technologists or as people who listen to Microsoft, we may say, oh, but this is the new thing, so we have to use the new thing. And that is rarely the right answer for your user base. You have to consider every technology rollout as a change management challenge. So you want to always understand where they're coming from and where you think they ought to end up, and figure out what that path is.
So Mark Christman made a comment about he sees that first bullet as small team collaboration, which is inclusive of project teams, formal and informal business teams, like the 3 to 20 user kind of thing. And Krista agrees with that, and I think that is our thinking on that one. That first bullet point, we're sort of talking about that type of group of users. So that I think that's a really good definition and good to sort of box.
Yeah, I mean, right? I think a project, regardless of whether you use the word project or project initiative, unit of work, it's really a unit of work that some identified group of people is working together on to reach some sort of common goal. They tend to have a beginning, they tend to have an end. Like the morale committee might not ever have an end because morale is always shitty, so we're going to keep working on it. But generally speaking, units of work do have a beginning and an end, and that's really what we're talking about here. So
We're all laughing at the comment in the chat of morale or morale, and
Yeah.
depends on your spelling. So
Yeah.
Moral and moral. Yeah, there's no such thing as moral anymore, apparently, or ethic. But
yeah.
you can add an N to the an E to the end of that too. So I think, within any group of people, and teams teams working on a project tend to be, the 3 to 20 person size. You get much bigger than that, it's not really a project, it's a free for all. What we tend to do a lot of is real-time collaboration, right? We need to be able to interact with each other in order to have discussions, share content, point out web links we've found that are useful, fill out forms and have somebody review them. All of that sort of stuff is something that we need to do a lot of as a smaller group of people. We do this on our consulting projects all the time. We're in chat. We have an everyone chat because we're a 6-person company, so we can do an everyone chat instead of a company-wide team. At 6 would also work. We do a lot of screen shares. Julie and I were on a call this morning, and we showed each other some stuff that we were working on. We want to talk to each other like we're doing right now. We want to share some video, perhaps. So that real-time collaboration piece is really a part of any project work. Sometimes it's formal, like we're getting together in a meeting and having an agenda like this one and discussing a bunch of topics. And sometimes it's more ad hoc. So, hey, Todd, I just need to talk to you about this. I need to ask you a question. Could you shoot me that document I'm asking about?
Yeah, and I think when you get to the SharePoint, versus team or conversation with the project team collaboration, we sort of talked about this when we were prepping, in the idea that, way back in the beginning of SharePoint, you had those other tools to do chat or communication. If you're as old as us, you were
OCS.
you were using the phone in the
OCS.
first early days. You were using the phones, yeah. But then you get to email communications, or then you came OCS, all the link, those early communication tools like that. And I think where this ends up, AOL Instant Messenger, absolutely. Wait, what was the one? The one that we love the most. I can't think of the name of it.
Trillion.
Trillion.
Yes.
The best chat client ever. Trillion. Oh my God, so good. Wish that was back. But I think the thing we're talking that we're sort of trying to get at here is that if you have this real-time communication now, we have Teams as a tool to bring that real-time communication to the project. And so if it, back to Todd's original point, if it works for your organization, bringing Teams in as the client of choice when working on team-based projects, as we've defined it, ends up making really good sense. If you don't need that real-time collaboration for the team, then maybe you don't need to use the Teams client. You can use the SharePoint client, and so that goes back to it's not an or, it's an and it depends on how your team needs to work.
I think some of all joking aside about some of the history here, I think sometimes it's useful to think back to the dark ages, which I remember better than anyone else on the call. Which
you don't remember anything.
Yeah. But like what real world thing are we replacing, right? So for example, if it's a very content centric process, that meant in the old days we would have a filing cabinet and we would all go put stuff in that filing cabinet and we'd borrow it when we needed it. Sometimes in the old days we would actually get into rooms together and have meetings and put stuff up on the blackboard, not the whiteboard. So if you think about what's the real world or the old-fashioned way of doing things that you're replacing, that can be a hint to what would be useful to replace now. So for example, if you had that filing cabinet and the work was really centralized around that filing cabinet, then it's a document-based thing. Then you want to be making sure that you're storing all your documents, maybe using Teams as the front end, but they're ending up in SharePoint. So sometimes some people may decide to work from the SharePoint interface, some from the Teams interface, and it works fine because it's the same documents. You're just looking through two different windows.
Oh, that's an interesting point Krista just brought up. She said, in my organization, I ask users what level of permissions they want as well when discussing Teams versus SharePoint, since team members have more permissions than standalone SharePoint groups. And that's actually more directed, not SharePoint versus Teams, although I see what she means by that. That's more around team, group-enabled team site, with Teams, or communication site, or not group-enabled team site, right? So it's the security paradigm around the underlying SharePoint site that's the interesting piece of that.
Yeah, in my area, a lot of the questions are about document management and document repositories. So it's, what do the people who need to have access to this site need to do with that document? Is it edit it, read only, and all that? So that's usually the questioning or line of questioning that I kind of go with for users when they're trying to figure out what they do or what they need to do or what they want to have.
So Krista, can you help me understand what you mean, since team members have more permission than standalone SharePoint groups?
Sorry, just based on what Julie was saying about the group members. So when you create a new team, it has the members and the owners, those underlying group permissions. And since the default level of members gives everybody full edit access to the team and the corresponding SharePoint site and all of the content on the SharePoint site, like the pages, the connected SharePoint site, I should say. So all the pages, all of the documents, they can delete all the libraries, everything like that. Versus if it's a standalone SharePoint site where you can add somebody into a specific group of members, owners, visitors, and give them, a little bit more, it's just a little bit of an easier permissions management side of it. I find on the standalone side, or a little bit more controlled, I should say, if there is that need to have read-only access for people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I was just curious what level of permission the group connected site allows you to give that, like the SharePoint local, members group doesn't have. Because I think of being the other way. The SharePoint permissions are more granular and better than Teams permissions.
Yes, sorry, that is what I meant. If that's not what I said, I apologize. It's just because the teams would have higher permissions than read-only. So if you wanted to, lock a particular document or a library down from a Teams perspective, you would have to do a little bit more finagling, I guess, to have someone still have access to the Teams side of it, where they would be able to edit the content and post to the Teams chat and all of that kind of stuff, versus the SharePoint site connected to it. If there's specific areas that need to be locked down, there's a little bit more group management. I think it'd be a little bit, it's a little bit more complex as opposed to, I find it easier on the standalone SharePoint side to just put someone in, either if they need to edit it, put them in the members group. If they need to read it, put them in the visitors group.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And when you think about it from a Microsoft Teams perspective, it's sort of a simplified version of some of the landscape that we can get to in SharePoint. And that's intentional, right? Permissions are either you're an owner or a member. Your files go into a folder, and that's it, right? So we actually had a separate scenario here for a structured business process. So for instance, if your team members have different roles, and therefore based on those different roles, they should be able to get to different stuff, that sort of starts to fit into this scenario more. But here we're thinking more about teams that are, roughly equivalent roles. I mean, somebody's usually in charge and some other people have, like you take care of this and you take care of this, but it's more of an equal access kind of a team where, maybe it's smaller, maybe it's more the 3 than the 20. I think when you get into bigger teams, you tend to get more specialization. So Teams gives us a simplified window into that backend that SharePoint provides us for files, and a simplified way to think about permissions. You're either in or you're out. Channels don't give you different permissions unless you make a private channel, which is a separate SharePoint site under the covers. But channels lets you separate things by topics. So everyone still has access to all the topics, but they still have the same permission level.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it feels like, and this is just my viewpoint of it, right? That in order to get around exactly what Krista is talking about, that like the team is either an owner or a member, and what that entails, where with historical permission structures, we'd have those 3 levels. Now to have multiple levels, we create channels that end up being their own SharePoint site with their own permission paradigm to them. So it's just a different way of getting to the same thing we already had with the SharePoint permissions, except for now it's Office 3 or Microsoft 365 groups that are controlling those buckets versus the permissions being a SharePoint construct, like a SharePoint group and members in SharePoint. It's just a different way of getting to the same thing, but it is complicated to understand. And I know, Mark, you definitely feel very strongly that that whole private channel thing, shared channel thing is just very complicated to understand.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan. I understand why they did it, but you know, to me, if you have a team and you want to carve out some of the teamwork to a separate group of people, it's a different team, right?
Yeah.
Like you're the project managers, you're the project doers. Let's create 2 separate teams.
Although then you
Or
get into
something.
the UX of that, where there's multiple teams down the left side and you're jumping back and forth, and that's confusing too. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's a lot.
I do actually use private channels.
Yeah. You said that there.
I know. But my use case is that I have a big client, and they have a team for a specific group of projects that's being run by this one portfolio. And you know, I needed to keep it inside that team, but the work I was doing had, you know, specific financials for the project and stuff like that wasn't available, that I didn't want to be available to everybody. So in that instance, I did create a private channel, and I put just the people that needed access to it. So not for nothing, I don't go around using them every day, but I definitely have found a singular use case for them.
And if you're living in Teams and you create a private channel, it makes total sense, right? Because you're still in the Teams interface, you see a channel or you don't see a channel, not confusing. I think where those of us who came from the SharePoint world get sort of caught up in this but it then creates a separate SharePoint site. So now you've got 2 places that you might have to go, but that's not the point, right? The point is that you're coming at it from a Teams perspective.
Right. They're ignoring the fact that there's 2 SharePoint sites because they figure you shouldn't care because you're using the Teams UI, which brings it all together.
Yep.
It's
Exactly.
I mean, it is actually kind of the same argument that we use when we say if you have users who have a lot of work to do and they have their individual places and you're going to roll that up. Mark, you used this example this morning for a policy center, right? So a whole bunch of people work on their policies in their own little fiefdoms, and you roll those policies up using a content type. It's that same idea, although it's different, right? But it's the same idea. If you have one UI that gets them, or user experience that gets them to all the places they need to go, does it really matter to them that they are different SharePoint sites under the covers? Right. I'm not here to argue either. I'm just
sometimes I think because we understand how everything works under the covers, we're almost at a disadvantage in some of these conversations.
Right.
It's like, yeah, but that's going to cause it actually doesn't matter. I mean, from a site sprawl perspective, it matters, but does site sprawl matter? And you know, we could debate that for another hour.
Lots of comments in the chat.
Yeah,
I can't even keep up. Holy cow!
A lot of conversation about private channels.
Yeah, if anyone wants to come off mute and just tell us what you think, that's totally fine.
Yeah, interrupt Mark. We don't want him to keep talking.
Mike asked me to do the slides, man. It's not my fault.
Blame it on Gil Ronan.
This was an interesting statement. Go ahead, Lou. Yeah, go.
Comment on the private channels. The way we use it is, again, the client project. We need an internal channel for our team to do that communication and have everything, you know, managed that way, and then surface artifacts as needed into the public channels for the client. so that they can then have access. So from that perspective, it works well for us. And then the way I push migrations from on-premises to 365 is, if you had an old SharePoint site and it was just department, not org-wide, then I would push you to using a Microsoft Teams, and then create a Teams for that. And then underneath there, then you may want a private channel that is for the management team of the department, so that they can communicate separately from the rest of the department members. And so that's another use case scenario that I've seen where you want the private channel. The only thing I don't like about private channels is that you're mentioning is that it's actually a hidden site collection, right?
Right.
It's not seen in your active site. So then, in some scenarios that may be an issue, where then you may then have to rely on some PowerShell to generate a port so you can see all your site collections.
I think they're fixing that, Lou. From what I have heard recently, I think they're going to fix that, but you're absolutely right. That's definitely an issue.
But I think that's an excellent scenario, Lou, and I just added it to that selected use cases slide, which is why I went back, because I wanted to see if it would update right away. It did not. I've just added a scenario at the bottom for external collaboration, because you're right. If you have an extranet site, we used to do this with Lotus Notes. You could have like half of a Lotus Notes database available to everyone and half only available to the team. So that is a very common need, and Teams with a private channel or two is a great way to do that. So we'll probably talk about that more at another time.
I'm curious as why Mark says that the service delivery managers have heartburn from private channels.
Yeah,
I'm not following that.
Could I speak to that?
Yeah.
Do.
Okay.
Yeah, the business case I see for private channels a lot is for a project team site. I got a project I'm working on. There's maybe 25 members of that, but I have project financials that maybe 2 or 3 people should see and no one else.
Right.
No one else needs to see rates, comp, etc. That's a great use case for a private channel, because that information lives in that, should be part of that project. I should be able to get to it through that interface, but no one else should see it.
yeah, it's very similar to Derek's use case.
Yep.
So, yep.
About the question about the service managers getting aggravated with private channels, I think has to do with propagation of site collections and governance. If you have any governance automation implemented at all, those private channel sites are not often, if ever, found through the SharePoint interface. So if you have a way of notifying people, hey, your site might go away because you're not using it, they're never going to see it via that method, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so it's how I think Mike is addressing the point of, if you're using a governance tool and you're trying to interact with the users, those hidden sites that get created because of those private channels could end up accidentally being removed simply because you can't get to the user visibly, right? So that's absolutely a tricky part of that. And I think they are addressing it. Like I said, I feel like I've heard that they're going to try to put it into get it surfaced up into the active sites if they haven't already. Yeah, so, but yeah. And then if you can use a Teams bot maybe to interact with the users instead of the SharePoint UX to interact with the users, that could help.
Does bots solve everything? No,
it just gives you a way to get to those people, right? Like to communicate with them into their private channel, like, yeah. Hey, are you still using this? I noticed no communications happened or whatever.
One thing we didn't talk about yet that's on our list here is the project team lifecycle. Does anybody want to jump on that one? Provision, govern, deprovision.
I think that ended up being a conversation around provisioning team sites and then having a team site for every team that you create, and if you have any kind of business process in that team, how you provision those things. So if you have any extensibility needs in each team, how do you how do you provision that? And that becomes especially difficult if you're using sort of the Power Platform tools, because they're not especially good at that kind of SDLC, deployment kind of lifecycle thing. And so I think that's the only conversation we were having about them.
What else have we missed here? I mean, obviously we're jumping all over the place, but that's sort of how we do this, I think. Was there a question that anyone has, or something that we should? There's Krista. Say something, Krista.
Not a question per se, but I can give a bit of an example on the task management side. I have a Teams space that my team uses, and we have a number of workflow tasks come through there. So certain things that we need to do or accomplish, or regular occurring things that we need to do, will have mentions pop up in one of the Teams channels. So it's not just reliant on myself to do it. It doesn't go directly to my email. It'll go to the Teams channel, and anybody on the team would be able to see that and can kind of go through it. It's worked quite well for us, because sometimes we lose a lot of stuff in our email itself. So it's nice to have that kind of pop up on Teams through the banner and things like that. That's just a little personal anecdote.
How many of you are using all of these hundreds of connectors inside Teams in your regular project teams? Are you typically using files and chat, and that's pretty much it? Or are you using lots and lots of other apps or services in that team space?
I've used some of the other ones, like embedding Planner and lists and things like that, most of the Microsoft 365 specific ones, but we don't use too many external tools, so we haven't really used a lot of them outside of that.
Yeah, so with task management, mostly Planner, or just a wiki or a OneNote saying, here's what you need to do, check this box if you're done.
Yeah, we pretty much just create some Power Automate workflows with different lists, or anywhere on our SharePoint site, if something's due, we have a due date coming through and a reminder, so-and-so, that type of stuff, yeah.
Case where Planner is even the simplicity of Planner is more complex than the way you want to manage your tasks. You just build a list that has the simple stuff you need, right?
Yeah, I use SharePoint lists and Microsoft lists now for so many things, and yeah, it's most of my task management. A lot of it I tend to use on there, and tracking action items for groups and creating kind of custom lists for things like that. I know that's getting out of the off topic a bit, but yeah, and then being able to embed those lists or add them as tabs along the top of a team space has helped quite a bit for many of the groups that I'm in.
And you're undoubtedly coming at it from a SharePoint history, right? So,
absolutely, yeah. I started with standalone.
Yeah, it's really interesting when we have conversations with people who are coming in and they've started with Teams, because a lot of these discussions are slanted in a very different direction. They are much more likely to use Planner. They're much more likely to use some of the other apps and services, I think, because they like that sort of plug and play thing, where a lot of us with the SharePoint history, we're like, well, how can I get this SharePoint thing to happen inside of Teams?
Yeah, and actually that's another one that Viva Connections sort of brings forward a little bit. The whole Viva Connections idea is to create a personal app, and a personal app is basically one of the is an icon along the left-hand side rail of Teams, where your chat and your Teams icons are. And so you can create a, we've talked about this before, but you can create a personal app that then surfaces a SharePoint site or a SharePoint page or whatever that might be full screen into the Teams window. And so it's another way to sort of have it be an and conversation versus an or conversation. If you really have, like, say, the home page of your intranet that you really want to surface for people who primarily work in the Teams UX because it happens to be project-based work that they do, and Teams is the right tool for them or the tool that they choose, being able to bring your intranet to them, or anything else, actually. I mean, I think it's one of the missed things that these personal apps are just JSON file that points to a URL. And so you can set up a manifest for your personal app to be whatever thing you want to be surfaced inside of that window. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a SharePoint site. So it's an interesting, the site that the thing that you surface has to be able to live inside of an iframe. Some websites block that ability, but in general, you can surface what you need to surface for people to be able to get to them. So.
And
cool.
You know what? In a similar vein to that, I would say one of the most missed things is the cloud connection on the Files tab to connect to other SharePoint document libraries.
Yeah.
This seems to be something where people keep thinking, oh, that's for connecting to outside sources, you know? But there's so much amazing things that you can do just by creating shortcuts to all the other places that we've hidden things. And I use this for a lot of my clients prior to the migration, you know? Like eventually we're going to migrate that data from here to there. But in the meantime, I can just drop a folder that connects to its current location. And then that way you can build that one single pane of glass for the users.
Yep. And keep them in context. And I think that's a big thing. The switching context, Emily, when she talks about this, it's one of the things she focuses on all the time is that, switching context and, how much time we lose by doing that. So it's a really important piece. Oh, we're over time. We should show the last.
We are
slide.
over time. We have a couple of resources here. Teams and SharePoint orchestration. See what we did. Good one, Mike. And then there's should I store my files in Teams or SharePoint? It's one of the Microsoft Community Docs articles that you might find helpful. Next time we will be doing another use case for Teams and SharePoint, and as usual, the edges of these will sort of spill over onto each other, but we have that other set of scenarios that we'll be talking through on the next call. We may talk about more than one, we may talk about only one, but you'll know if you come and join us.
Awesome. Cool.
So
thanks everybody for coming.
We'll see you.
Everybody, thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, guys.